Welcome back to the class. This is lecture 5, and we are going to explore some more on the maritime work. The written records are sparse, but we treasure the accounts written about travel to Buddhist sites. They're mainly authored by Chinese pilgrims and a handful of government envoy reports. Nevertheless, a picture of the movement of Buddhist pilgrims and teachers along the Great Circle is slowly emerging. We now know that the travel was two ways. As we see from the votive stupas with inscriptions found in Southeast Asia, local pilgrims were going to India and returning to their homes, making sea journeys of hundreds of miles. The sea lanes stories are filled with accounts of round trips. Sailing circuits were made by crafts that moved in a specific boundary, sailing back and forth in both directions, giving assurance of the ability to return home by the same method as the outward journeys. Now, we're more familiar with the accounts of the arrivals in Chang'an of monastic translators in the 2nd century of the Common Era than with those tied to the seaports. Even though the recorded data is limited, it is possible to construct a view of the maritime by piecing together information found in a number of different types of data. For example, Chinese government records provide a 3rd century view of sites such as Akeo in the Mekong Delta. Envoys from China in 245 to about 250 of the Common Era report visiting this bustling city built on stilts as a response to the yearly flooding of the river during the monsoon season. Well, today, Akeo is a quiet 1,000-acre rice field with only a small museum at one end. One of the exhibits of the museum is an exposed area showing the remains of building sites and streets that lie just below the surface. These artifacts include images that belong to Brahmanism and Buddhism, and it gives us some idea of what the Chinese visitors saw so many centuries ago. A surprising discovery was a number of larger-than-life Buddha images carved from local wood found buried in the mud along the ancient canals near Akeo. Because of the anaerobic process of the mud, these wooden images have survived in remarkably good condition. They are similar in style to Amaravati on the east coast of India. Modern technology for dating wood indicates that these images can, with high probability, be dated to 1,500 years ago, having sophisticated and professionally carved images of the Buddha made from large trees growing in the delta indicates that there was a significant Buddhist community that included artisans and the resources to pay them. The fact that the contact between Akeo and China was of such significance that a delegation would be sent to visit this relatively remote site is evidence of regular travel and commercial activity between the Han Coast and the shores of the so-called South Seas. This geopolitical visit from China was taking place at the same time that caravans were crossing Inner Asia from India, heading for Chang'an. The port at Akeo was connected through a series of canals with waterways that linked the city to a hinterland stretching all the way to Angkor Wat in the northern area of Cambodia. Such a complex of rivers, lakes, canals, ports, inland cities, and roads is vivid proof of the size of commercial and cultural activities in the region that gave support to Buddhism. Once again, remote sensing and new technology are allowing scholars to identify the buried outlines of ancient cities, such as Akeo and Angkor Wat. We can now see from underground structures that Angkor Wat, centuries after the demise of Akeo, was one of the largest cities on Earth. While it is many miles inland, one can still travel to it from the Mekong Delta by boat. Hinterlands that are reached by water from seaports can be as long as the 1,000-mile route from Shanghai to Sichuan up the Yangtze River and its tributaries. Records of maritime activity among Buddhist travelers takes us to the first years of the 5th century of the Common Era. The travel by Buddhist monastics along the sea and caravan routes seems to have been in full flow by this time period. A number of travelers from Kashmir, South India, Sri Lanka, and China are reported in the literature. Among them was Faxian, one of the pioneering monks on the pilgrimage route from China to India. It is an important moment in history because it indicates that Chinese monks were able to address issues of doctrine and practice and set out to find answers, even if it meant traveling thousands of miles to India. His motivation for travel was to find the Vinaya text that it would allow Chinese monastics to live fully by the rules of conduct said to have been laid down by the Buddha. His travel alerts us to the important concerns of Buddhists in China, as well as the maritime ports. The monastic growth in China had begun to raise questions about how East Asian monks and nuns were to be viewed from the perspective of rules of conduct, ordination requirements, and even dress. It was becoming obvious that there were distinct differences between missionary monks and local monastics. These questions about how to act, which rules to follow, how to dress, what rituals were necessary for Chinese monks and nuns, dominated the attention of the 5th century travelers. Faxian states that the conditions among the Chinese monastics was varied to the point of chaotic ways of living. Missionary monks had often been harsh judges of what they saw among those who were pioneering in a life apart from that of householders. Distressed by these problems, Faxian determined to go to India, directly to India, and get a complete set of rules to establish a recognized and authentic monastic community in China. Well, Faxian's information about making such a long trip indicated that India was toward the west. Therefore, he set out to travel those roads that were used by animal caravans to relay goods between the west coast ports of India and the hinterland tracts along its rivers to Chang'an. It was a difficult journey, and he reports that he followed trails marked by the bones of horses and camels that perished along the great inland desert of the Taklamakan Basin. Once moving beyond the heat and often waterless areas, he describes the dangers of the high mountains. Crossing the Indus River was a nerve-wracking experience of edging along sheer rock cliffs with a reported 700 steps cut into the surface, leading down to the rushing waters that were spanned by rope suspensions. It is perhaps these problems of travel that led him to return home by a different route. Crossing rivers flowing down slopes of high mountain ranges was always a dangerous event. One wonders if the route Faxian took crossing the Indus to reach the pilgrimage sites of the Buddha's life left behind the major caravans heading south to the west coast in port cities. There's no way that caravans could have made it down the hundreds of steps to reach the rope crossing. So it appears he decided to take the shortest route to the Ganges by making it over the Indus and into the trails that connected to the eastern river system. The description is an acknowledgement of the fact that the Indus starts on the Tibetan Plateau at over 16,000 foot elevation and drops down to the plains. It cuts some of the deepest river gorges in the world. Faxian crossed at a place which was narrow enough to have a rope suspension across it. But in such places, the speed and the amount of flow made it very dangerous. Well, after managing to get across the rushing waters cascading down the canyons of the Indus, he made his way to Tamluk, present-day Kolkata region, in western Bengal, moving through the Gangetic Basin, where he visited the sites of Buddha's life. At the Bay of Bengal, he stepped aboard a ship, and he became a maritime traveler, sailing rather than walking or riding animals on the land routes to South India and across to Sri Lanka. It was his introduction to the world of sailing ships, and he provides us with an invaluable description of what it was like for the pilgrims who crossed the open seas. The voyage down the coast of India was not without discomfort and dangers. The first ship he joined was a large one. It was manned by a crew of 200 men from the Western Indian Ocean. That portion of the Bay of Bengal is the site for many cyclones, and Faxian's voyage was beset by one of these fierce storms. Fortunately, he made it to his destination, an indication that ships were being built that could withstand the impact of the waves generated by such high winds. Even so, the people on board his vessel were frightened by the conditions and feared for their lives. We can only speculate on how many crafts have been sunk over the centuries by such massive storms, and how many artifacts are still survive on the ocean floor. He does not relate information about the final destination of the ship on which he rode, except to indicate that he took it in order to reach Sri Lankan shores. This account alerts us to the complex structure that already existed by 400 of the Common Era for maritime trade. Merchant seamen were making long trips east of India from their homelands in Africa and the Arab world. They were part of the commercial activity that was taking place in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Nile River, all portals for trade extending across the Mediterranean Sea. The technology of shipbuilding described by Faxian had developed to the point of having a size that could accommodate a large number of crew, as well as water and food supplies for as long as 75 to 80 days, not to mention the tonnage of the cargo. Therefore, he could find it possible to travel down the east coast of India in a vessel that had come from distant ports and was built strong enough to cross the open seas. His stay in Sri Lanka was productive. He found texts of interest and visited important monasteries. One of these was Abhayagiri, which had strong ties to Mahayana, but also had a large community of nuns. Here he came into contact with a practicing group of nuns who were fully ordained and living by the Vinaya. As a result of this contact with a sizable group of ordained women, among the texts that Faxian carried back to China were the rules of conduct for nuns. Now, 10 nuns from Abhayagiri would, within the next 2 decades, follow Faxian on the maritime journey to Guangzhou. They hoped to make it possible for Chinese women to be fully ordained in a ritual performed by 10 monks and 10 nuns. This would be a double ordination that was considered to be essential for Chinese women to be considered as legitimate nuns. Now, one of the monks in Faxian's entourage recognized an insurmountable problem. He knew that the Vinaya rules for monastics would be too difficult to follow in China. Just the climate difference between the tropics and the frigid winters of northern China ruled out being clothed only in cotton cloth, bearing one's shoulder when going to make begging rounds, and having feet clad in sandals or barefoot. This must have been a harsh truth to decide that after coming such a long distance with all the associated hardships and dangers, in the end, there would never be a solution of taking home the instructions and rules and have Chinese monastics in complete compliance with the Vinaya rules. One monk decided that the only way he could follow the Vinny rules was to abandon his original goal of carrying the full set of regulations home. He decided to stay in India or Sri Lanka, where it was possible to have the whole community of monastics faithfully adhering to the Vinaya. He never returned to China. Well, therefore, while Faxian and others put forth great effort to secure the rules of conduct followed by the monks of South Asia, these required ways of action and dress that proved impractical for the Chinese Sangha and were never put into full practice. Well, Faxian stayed in Sri Lanka, copying texts and securing valuable copies of others that he believed to be of importance for his homeland. After being there for nearly 2 years, he saw a merchant making a gift of a white silk fan from China. It implies that he had left behind Chinese cultural contact as he moved on the long trek through Inner Asia. Now in Sri Lanka, he came into the sphere of direct trade contact with China. Seeing the fan and hearing of ships that were sailing toward his homeland, he was overwhelmed with a desire to return to China and made the decision to take a faster route of travel by sea rather than retrace his original route on the caravans of Inner Asia. For the travel differences between caravans and ships, it is important to note that ships on the open sea move constantly for 24 hours a day. There is no stopping to rest, nor any need to feed animals every night. Depending on the speed of the wind, a ship might move as much as 200 miles in a single day, or conversely, sit nearly fixed in place when the winds die down. The sailing circuit for those open ocean-going ships was defined by the direction and the speed of the only power they could use, the winds. Monsoons blew in one direction for half a year, then reversed and blew in exactly the opposite direction. It was this pattern of monsoon wind power that made it possible to travel long distances in one direction and return within a period of 1 year. The Greeks had calculated that the speed of the wind and the consistency of its flow and direction across the Indian Ocean from Africa was sufficient to make it possible for a merchant to travel from the Red Sea to India and back in a year. It would have been necessary for Faxian's ship coming down the coast from the Bay of Bengal to rely on the winds, most probably during the northeast monsoon, when the flow was toward the south, that is October to December. His journey onward toward China from Sri Lanka would have depended on the southwest monsoon, July to September, moving toward the east and the north. Leaving Sri Lanka, his trip was once again beset by a cyclone, and the crew of the ship threw cargo overboard to keep afloat. Faxian feared that they would soon jettison the copies of the Buddhist text that he had so carefully collected. He tells of even more tension with the crew during the crisis of the storm. They began to threaten to toss Faxian into the sea, since they feared that he had brought bad luck with him. His fellow countrymen warned the crew that if they did so, the Chinese authorities would hear of it and mete out severe punishment for the murder of a Buddhist monk. Well, the episode indicates that the crew was not Buddhist, but rather another example of sailors in the Andaman Sea who came from the western regions of the Indian Ocean. But the troubles of winds and waves was not over for Faxian. After weeks of sailing across the Andaman Sea and into the South China Sea, the monsoon winds blew them northward along the coast of China. The ship missed the Pearl River entrance to Guangzhou, and the crew lost all knowledge of their position. Now, this was a time long before the method had been of determining longitude had been developed. Well, finally, after more than 70 days in the sea, the ship was beginning to run out of water and food. And uncertain of their location, they landed to try to find someone who could tell them where they were. To their surprise, they were at the Shandong Peninsula, more than 1,000 miles north of Guangzhou. Well, ironically, Faxian was now closer to the capital than he would have been had they made their original landing at Guangzhou. Faxian's search for the Vinaya text was part of the early 5th century effort to not only deal with correct rules for conduct of monks, but also to organize a proper ordination for nuns in China. While he carried back at least some of the rules for nuns that he found in Sri Lanka, there was still the issue of whether any women in China had received an authentic ordination. The matter of correct ordination became the major Vinaya issue, more important than the dozens of rules regarding daily life and dress. This was not solved by Faxian and his text. It remained a matter of concern when an important monk, Gunavarman, 367 to 431, arrived in Guangzhou. Now, we will discuss the role of Gunavarman in our next lecture and the way in which the ordination of nuns in China was finally resolved. These accounts of pilgrims, sailing ships, cyclone storms, information being sent by sea to distant ports, gives us a glimpse of the activities that were in place as Buddhist monks and supporters established themselves in the world of maritime commerce in the early centuries of the Common Era. It makes us realize just how complicated and difficult it was for the Buddhist tradition to make its way around the Great Circle. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time with Lecture 6.